Victor Hugo had personal experience more than once of how hostile an environment water could be. His daughter, Leopoldine, drowned in the river Seine, and the thought of that drowning haunted him. The manuscript of Les Misérables almost fell into the sea during the Hugo's family's crossing from Jersey to Guernsey in 1855. In an era when there were no photocopies, no Google Docs, and no hard disks to save one's creative output, this would have been a disaster for the author and for humanity. Once, during a crossing between the mainland and Guernsey, the packet boat he was traveling on was in danger of sinking. The sea is first and foremost, therefore, in Hugo's life and in his imagination, a hostile and terrifying element. But at the same time, he was to find in Jersey and then Guernsey the calm environment he needed to write his greatest masterpieces, overlooking the sea in his lookout in Hauteville House. Contemplation of the sea acted as a spur to his creativity. At the beginning of William Shakespeare, 1864, he ends his description of Marine Terrace with these words. This is a picture made for Juliette Drouet, and you find their initials, V.H. in red and J.D. in brown, above Marine Terrace. That's how he described in William Shakespeare Marine Terrace. It's a description of each room and ending this way. The noise of the sea, ever present. Le bruit de la mer, toujours entendu. It was to be the same with Hauteville House. Hugo wrote his greatest masterpieces lulled by the sound of the waves. It changed his vision of the world. This is what we will find when we examine in his novels, his poetry, theatre, his humanitarian and artistic works, the themes of running aground, of shipwrecks at sea, and of drowning. I will analyze the literary, moral, and philosophical aspects of each example. We will see how Hugo exploits these scenes in his novels, his drama, his letters and journals, and to what kind of creative end, what moral he draws from them, what their ethical model may be. The most dramatic event associated with the sea is that of the shipwreck, with its less dramatic but still troubling variation, running aground. These are illustrations of the human condition, of adversity, instability, and despair. The most famous of these symbols of marine adversity is the lonely fight of Gilliatt in the toils of the sea for his master's boat, the Durande, which had run aground in the Channel Islands. The whole novel is taken up with the epic story of the sailor, whose motivation, even more than loyalty to his master, is to marry his daughter, the young and beautiful Déruchette. Spending days and days camped out on his rock, so that he can bring back, if not the boat itself, which had run fairly conclusively aground, at least its engine, which could still be put to use. Gilliatt finds, against the rain, against the wind, against the salt spray, against the surf, and even a giant octopus, and achieves his aims in the end. In moments of rest or despondency, lying naked on his rock, feeling the vibrations of the ocean, the breath of the wind, the encouraging cries of the birds, he's at one with the universe. In this novel, to which it gives its name, the sea serves as a creative expression of the solitary adventure, an ethical expression of self-development. This struggle of fragile humanity against the wild elemental sea takes another form, this time that of the storm, whose victims are the poor fishers forced to risk their lives on the sea in order to feed the population. The poem, The Poor People, from La Légende des siècles, celebrates their courage. In this poem, without thinking twice, a fisherman and his wife adopt the children of their dead neighbor, a woman who has starved to death. Their intention is to feed them, along with their own children, on the meager produce of their fishing. The fisherman and his wife both share the same fear of the abyss. While the woman prays, thinking about her husband at sea, l'océan l'épouvante. I'm going to read the quotations in French when it's poetry, because of the rhythm of poetry, and in English when it is prose or theatre. L'océan l'épouvante et toutes sortes d'ombres passent dans son esprit. La mer, les matelots, emportés à travers la colère des flots. He himself, during this time, horreur, l'homme dont l'onde éteint le hurlement, sans fondre et s'enfoncer le bâtiment qui plonge. Il sent s'ouvrir sous lui l'ombre et l'abîme, et songe au vieil anneau de fer du quai plein de soleil. Given an identity, made physical, brought to life, the ocean is perceived as a terrifying being. Hugo, in most cases, affords it a capital letter. L'océan, the ocean with a capital letter, which he does not when he refers to the sea. That capital letter marks it out as a strange entity, god or beast or monster, or the principle of evil, beyond the reach of human, pitiless. However, despite the extreme peril of a potential shipwreck, life on the sea teaches the fisherman the meaning of effort, of helping one another, and of thanks to God, which is the reason why, although he returns empty-handed, with no fish that night, he unhesitatingly adopts the children of the dead woman. In this poem, to which it gives a setting, the ocean serves as a creative expression of the epic in the ordinary, an ethical expression of sacrifice. The social aspect of the poem, The Poor People, which can be gleaned even from its title, is absent from Hugo's other great poem about shipwrecks, Oceano Nox. I chose this illustration that Gérard showed us this morning for Oceano Nox. It's a poem from Les Rayons et les Ombres, 1840. This is no surprise why the social aspect of Les Pauvres Gens is absent from Oceano Nox. It's no surprise because Oceano Nox was written in an earlier period of Hugo's life, when the poet, not yet a Republican, was less sensitive to the question of poverty. Nevertheless, it contains similar themes, beginning with that of the night, present as it is in the Latin title. Less social, it's also more metaphysical. This time, those who are shipwrecked are not fishers, but sailors. The first two verses describe how everyone is equal when faced with death, all social classes mingled together. Oh, combien de marins, combien de capitaines qui sont partis joyeux pour des courses lointaines, dans ce morne horizon se sont évanouis. Combien ont disparu dure et triste fortune, dans une mer sans fond, par une nuit sans lune, sous l'aveugle océan à jamais enfoui. Combien de patrons morts avec leurs équipages, l'ouragan de leur vie a pris toutes les pages, et d'un souffle il a tout dispersé sur les flots. Nul ne saura leur fin dans l'abîme plongé. Chaque vague en passant d'un butin s'est chargée, l'une a saisi l'esquif, l'autre les matelots. The next verse evokes in a pathetic diptych the corpses lost in the sea and their families anxious waiting. Then time does its work. The three following verses describe how, little by little, people forget the lost sailors. But then, if men and women forget those who have been lost at sea, who will remember them? Hugo finishes the poem by contrasting the earth, in which there is no cemetery keeping their bodies, with the ocean, which lends them its voice. Rien ne sait plus vos noms, pas même une humble pierre dans les 3 cimetières où l'écho nous répond, pas même un saule vert qui s'effeuille à l'automne, pas même la chanson naïve et monotone que chante un mendiant à l'angle d'un vieux pont. Où sont-ils les marins sombrés dans les nuits noires? Ô flots que vous savez de lugubres histoires, flots profonds redoutés des mers à genoux, vous voulez raconter en montant les marées, et c'est ce qui vous fait ces voix désespérées que vous avez le soir quand vous venez vers nous. The theme, common to this poem and the poor people, is the fear of the abyss. As in the poor people, the ocean here is personified by the final apostrophe to the waves. Oh, waves, waves. Addressed 6 times in the last verse, and by the voice the poet gives to them. Those disparate voices that you have in the evening on your way towards us. Although it is a hostile environment, the ocean is nevertheless a place that receives the bodies of the lost. Certainly less hospitable than a cemetery, where one can contemplate a person's memory at a specific place, but which nevertheless preserves the memory of suffering souls whose stories it tells through the roaring of its waves. Here, the ocean is used by Hugo as a place which is favorable to metaphysical reverie. The theme of the living, who eventually forget their dead in order to continue to live, goes considerably beyond the single circumstance of a drowning at sea. Is not every death of a person unknown through birth or through this destiny, body buried or not, fated to be forgotten? In this poem, to which it gives its Latin title, the ocean serves as a creative expression of the macabre, as an ethical expression of memory. Feeling pity for sailors lost at sea was part of Hugo's everyday life in Jersey and in Guernsey. In his notebook of the 27th of May 1858, he describes the wreck of Samuel Pengalet's boat, which was a postal packet between Guernsey and St. Malo. The boat, as he writes in his diary, went down with all hands in the hurricane of the night before last, crew and passengers all are dead. 4 days later, Hugo opened a subscription for the widows and orphans of the Pengalet disaster. As a thank you, Madame Pengalet would sometimes lodge Victor Hugo's guests in her house, which was opposite Hauteville House. Juliette Drouet's letters are evidence of the permanent state of anxiety Guernsey people were in when it came to shipwrecks, and Gwenaël spoke of this subject this morning. Here is one other letter about the same subject. Since this morning, the thick fog hanging over the sea means that we hear the deafening whistle from the port, which is intended to give some bearings to the poor vessels who have no idea where they are. I hope that will be enough to prevent collisions with rocks and shipwrecks around our little island. Sunset will probably cause the fog to fall away. The haunting memory of a shipwreck is such that Juliette writes Hugo a letter each time they are about to take a boat in case of disaster. And it is to exile itself, with its consequences, that Hugo compares a shipwreck. In a letter to a journalist, Jules Janin, who was a literary critic and who had published an account of the society event that forced sail of Hugo's furnishings from his Paris flat had become. Hugo thanked him for the sensitivity he showed in his article about the sale of his furnishing in Paris. So Hugo was not there, of course. Hugo was in Guernsey. That's what he writes to Jules Janin about his paper. That page you have just written floats over my wreckage. What matter the things that have sunk below the water? What saved Hugo from social and existential shipwreck? It was our wreckage. It was England. Hence the dedication of his William Shakespeare in 1864. To England, I dedicate this book to her, the glorification of her poet. I speak the truth to England, but as an illustrious and free country, I admire her, and as a place of refuge, I love her. The island, a terrestrial shelter in the middle of the ocean, is therefore the antithesis of a shipwreck, whether it be large, like Britain, or small, like Jersey and Guernsey, or tiny, like the rock on which the Durande ran aground in the toils of the sea. So whether it be large or small or tiny, the island is a refuge. On the rock, Gilliatt retrieves what can be saved of human industry. On Jersey and on Guernsey, Hugo rebuilds a small utopian society with the proscrit diaspora. In Britain, people enjoy freedom disrespected on the continent. Illustration of adversity for poor fishers, poor sailors, and poor travelers, the shipwreck is also for the powerful, the illustration of the fragility of their power. The shipwreck of the Invincible Armada on the 2nd of November 1588 is the background to the poem The Infanta's Rose from La Légende des Siècles. Its skillful construction contrives an extraordinary turnaround in circumstances. Firstly, in this poem, Hugo gives us the charming description of the Infanta, the young daughter of Philip II of Spain, contemplating a rose near a pool in her garden at the Escorial. Then, our attention is drawn from the garden towards the terrifying silhouette of the king, Philip II, seen through his palace window. We expect that he, like the poet and like the reader, will admire the sight of his charming daughter in the charming garden. But nothing of the sort. All his thoughts are turned to his political, military, and maritime power. After a long description of the power and authority of Philip II, the poet shows us what he sees in his mind, his fleet sent out to fight the English navy. Tout un vol de vaisseaux en fuite dans le vent, et dans l'écume, au pli des vagues, sous l'étoile, l'immense tremblement d'une flotte à la voile, et là-bas, sous la brume, une île, un blanc rocher, écoutant sur les flots ses tonnerres marcher. This island is Britain. L'armada, formidable et flottant point d'appui du levier dont il va soulever tout un monde, traverse en ce moment l'obscurité de l'onde. Le roi, dans son esprit, la suit des yeux, vainqueur, et son tragique ennui n'a plus d'autre lueur. The poet then lists all the different types of vessel and of sailor that the king has employed from across the belligerent Europe. Then, through a series of rhetorical questions, the king takes comfort in the certainty of his victory, which is, he believes, duly commensurate with his power. The invincible armada is wrecked in a gale, but Hugo, brilliantly, does not tell us what happens. Instead, he employs a counter-shot and returns to the initial scene of the Infanta, looking at her rose next to the pool in the palace garden. However, at the edge of the pool in silence, the Infanta still solemnly holds her rose, and sweet blue-eyed angel kisses it now and then. Suddenly a puff of wind, one of those breaths that the quivering evening throws out across the plains, reaches the tranquil child, and with a brush of its wing, swiftly, enough to shake a nearby branch of the tree, abruptly blows the petals of the flower into the pool. And the Infanta has nothing left in her hand but a thorn. She leans over and sees the debris in the water. She doesn't understand. What's that? She's scared. And what does she do but look to the sky in bewilderment for the breeze that had no fear of displeasing her? All the poor rose is scattered on the wave, its 100 petals, which the deep water drowns and rolls around, turning like in a shipwreck, and move away in every direction on 1,000 little waves whipped up by the breeze. It looked just like a fleet sinking into an abyss. "Madame," said the duenna, a shadow on her face, to the astounded and pensive little girl, "everything on earth belongs to kings, except the wind." "Madame," dit la duègne avec sa face d'ombre à la petite fille étonnée et rêvant, "tout sur terre appartient au prince, hors le vent." Hugo's genius consists in suggesting the shipwreck of the Armada, using the misfortune of the rose. A few illustrations will suffice. The double movement, which makes us come and go from the garden to the palace, and vice versa. Be drawn into the thought processes of King Philip through what he is seeing in his mind's eye, the victory of his Armada. The comparison of a major event in history with the mishap of the tiny, toute petite rose, as the Infanta is described in the first line of the poem. She is very young, a duenna looks after her. Elle est toute petite, une duègne la garde. This is an example of an apologue, a fable, whose punchline delivers the moral of the tale. Everything on earth belongs to kings, except the wind. The moral is given to the duenna. It's the duenna who says this last sentence. Her social status is positioned between belonging to the household, as she is in the service of a little princess, and the aristocracy, of which she is a member. A woman committed to caring, her duty is to guard, that is to say, to protect the Infanta, and not a man who is destined for struggle, combat. It is to her, and not to the all-powerful king, that the poet gives all the world's wisdom. In the play Hernani, 1830, Philip II's father, the father of this king, this blind king, Charles V, proves himself to be more prescient than his son in his knowledge of the ocean and in his analysis of the power of the great. This is demonstrating in his monologue in Act 4, Scene 2, where he expresses his holy terror in the face of the responsibility that has fallen to him after his election to the empire. Greatly affected by his elevation to the highest level of power, he realizes that even this position of greatness cannot protect him against revolution, and that true power lied in the hands of the mob, or the people, which he compares to the ocean. This vision comes to him like in a dream. Kings look down, at the ocean of humanity, at that ever-restless wave where nothing's cast that does not shake the whole, a wave that crushes a throne and rocks a tomb, a mirror in which a king rarely looks but ill-favoredly. If only they looked occasionally into this dark flood, they should find in its depth innumerable empires, great vessels wrecked that are disturbed by its ebb and flow, which would disturb it and which it no longer knows. the political cosmogony imagined by Hugo does away with the land, leaving the sky and the ocean to face off. The man of the people here is not associated with the fields on which he labors or the cities he builds on terra firma, but instead with the ocean, on which, however, he does not dwell. This comparison, drawn between the people and the ocean, demonstrates the fragility of power, which is like a flimsy skiff, the indomitable power of the people, which legitimizes it in a manner unthinkable in the 16th century, the period in which the drama is set. This legitimacy had, however, been tested 40 years before Hugo wrote this piece in 1929, during the French Revolution. In this tirade, where it acts as an extended metaphor for revolution, the ocean serves as an ethical expression of modesty from the king, a poetic expression of vertigo. Illustration of adversity and in the instability of all things, the ocean is also, in the work of Hugo, the place of despair, of drownings that don't happen by accident, but that are sought as a means of suicide. It's okay? There are at least 2 suicides by drowning in Hugo's novels. At the end of The Toilers of the Sea, that of Gilliatt in the Channel, in The Man Who Laughs, that of Gwynplaine in the Thames estuary. Let's start by looking at the suicide of Gwynplaine in The Man Who Laughs. In The Man Who Laughs. Gwynplaine succeeds at his second try. The first time, thinking he has lost his nearest and dearest, he is standing at the edge of the parapet from which he intends to throw himself into the Thames, when he feels the tongue of his wolf, Homo, licking him. This brings him back to life and to his adopted family. This is an odd family, made up of Ursus, an old showman, Dea, a young blind girl, the tame wolf, Homo, and Gwynplaine, a foundling become lord. After an unfair trial and a fantastical escape bid, he ends up by reconnecting with his family at the very moment that they, forced out of England, are preparing to leave for Holland. As the boat that is sailing down the Thames to reach the open sea is taking them to their new life, Dea, exhausted by grief, because she has lost Gwynplaine, she doesn't know where he is, she thinks he's dead, feels an intense happiness on finding Gwynplaine again, he's back. He's ready now to marry her. So intense is her joy that, being in a state of overwhelming fatigue because of her despair at having lost him, she dies of it. It was then Gwynplaine became terrifying. He stood up, lifted his head, and considered the immense night above him. Then, seen by no one, but perhaps watched in the darkness by someone invisible, he stretched out his arms to the depth above and said, "I'm coming." And he began to walk towards the edge of the boat on the deck, as if some vision was drawing him to it. We follow Gwynplaine's advance across the boat's deck for several paragraphs. His eyes are fixed on the heavens. In a few steps, he is at the very edge. "I'm coming," he said. "There, here am I." And he continued to walk. There was no railing. The void lay before him. He stepped forward. He fell. The night was thick and muffled. The water was deep. No one saw nor heard anything. The boat continued to sail and the river to flow. A little later, the boat entered the ocean. When Ursus came to his senses, he could no longer see Gwynplaine, and he noticed Homo at the edge of the boat, who was howling in the darkness and looking at the sea. Hugo paints a scene of understated horror, seen by no one except perhaps God and the wolf, swift and as inexorable as the hero's decision to die. Gwynplaine's body going under is all the more terrible because it is not described. There is no evocation of his body struggling, nor of the body under the water, nor of the actual moment of his death, nor of Gwynplaine's thoughts and feelings. Once again, the sea is in opposition not to the land, but to the sky, to which it is linked by the oxymoron, the depth above. For Hugo, who examines equally brilliantly both the infinitely large and the infinitely small, the sea and the sky become one. The final word of The Man Who Laughs, the sea, is also, in its last chapter, entitled The Great Tomb, the final word of the Toilers of the Sea. His heart broken at the departure of the woman he loves, Déruchette, in the company of a young Protestant minister, when he had put his own life in danger to rescue the engine of her father's boat run aground on a rock, Gilliatt is out on a point of the coast of Guernsey. This allows him to watch for as long as possible the boat which is carrying Déruchette and Ebenezer away. He sits on a crevice in the rock, which functions as a chair. The narrator describes the landscape he can see. Land, sea, sky mingled together, even including the friendly birds. Perhaps it's they, the birds, that see the scene, because Gilliatt is alone. When the rising tide reaches his feet and he does not move, the reader anticipates the inevitable ending, but an intention to commit suicide. As with the end of The Man Who Laughs, the suicide, this intention is never actually mentioned. The description of the changing landscape is punctuated during several paragraphs by indications of the hours as they pass, the tide as it rises, Gilliatt's body as it is little by little enveloped by the water. Suddenly a splashing sound and a sensation of cold caused him to look down. The water had reached his feet. Several paragraphs further. The water was getting up to his waist. Later, you could only see his head. And finally, there was now nothing there but the sea. Victorious over the high seas, Gilliatt is killed by the ocean, but anchored to the land. It's not the wilderness that kills him, nor the uncontrolled elements. It is his immense despair, the calamity of not being loved. Suicide for love at sea, Hugo was to come across such an event in a sensational news story in 1870. The steamer Normandie was shipwrecked, not far from here. Hugo wrote about it in an article he sent to the Republican newspaper founded by his sons, Le Rappel. He uses the human interest piece as a counterpoint to a eulogy he refused to give to a reactionary politician. On m'écrit pour me demander quelle impression a produite sur moi la mort de Montalembert. They wrote to me to ask me what impression the death of Montalembert had made on me. My answer? None. Absolute indifference. But here's something that did upset me. On board the steamer Normandy, which was lost at sea 4 days ago, there was a poor carpenter and his wife. There were people from here, from the parish of St. Saviour. They were returning from London, where the husband had been for a tumour he had in his arm. Suddenly, in the darkness of the night, the boat, broken in two, started to sink. Only one lifeboat remained. It was already full up with people and was about to push off and escape. The husband shouted, "Wait for us, we are getting in." The reply from the lifeboat came, "There's only room for a woman. Your wife should get in." "Go, wife," he said. And the wife replied, "For sure, I'm not going, me. There's no room for me. We'll die together, eh?" "Nenny, je n'irai pas. Il n'y a pas de place pour moi. Je mourrons ensemble." That Nenny is adorable. This heroism expressed in patois is heart-wrenching. A gentle Nenny and a gentle smile in the face of death. And the poor woman threw her arms around her husband's neck, and they both died. And I'm crying as I write this for you, and I'm thinking of my stalwart son-in-law, Charles Vacquerie. His son-in-law, Charles Vacquerie, as you know, had drowned with Leopoldine, having tried but failed to save her. This was, anyway, what the Hugo family believed. In the climaxes of these two plots of his novels, in which the sea has the last word, as in the tragic news story, the sea serves as a poetic expression of disaster and as an ethical expression of fidelity. Whereas the sea is at the same time the setting, the environment, and the illustration of adversity, of the instability of everything, and of despair, it is also, in Hugo's work, a reservoir of incidents for his novels and his theatre that are, as it were, providential. All Hugo's novels contain episodes taking place at sea that present extreme situations, plot twists that have you on the edge of your seat, like your students, Lisa, which ally suspense and strong emotion to moral or religious revelation. A spectacular example of one of these shipwrecked episodes occurs in The Man Who Laughs and takes up a whole book of 80 pages. Everything begins, as in Holy Scripture, with a sin, a guilt. It happens on the shore. Child stealers, the comprachicos, it's a Spanish name, who have disfigured Gwynplaine, the hero, the young hero, we don't know his name for the moment. They have disfigured him for the freak shows. Now wanted by the police for their illicit trade, abandon the young hero on a shore nearby, on the English coast. That was the first episode. The second episode tells the story of their doom at sea. You see, it's really a religious story. Sin before, sin, then doom. There is a violent storm nearby. They escape several dangers, including the terrifying Casquette's lighthouse, drawn here by Hugo, and Gérard showed it to us already, which in their eyes resembled a flaming pyre under an iron grill on top of a rock. After a close encounter with the reef, they find themselves out at sea again, where they avoid another reef. When the storm subsides, the reader thinks that they are safe. The sea then becomes dead calm, which in French we call bonasse. Contrary to expectations, it's the calm after the storm which will be their undoing, because they have lost their mast and sails, so once the wind drops, they can no longer move. Now, as the hull has been holed, they are going to sink. As they can no longer save their lives, they can now only save their souls, by confessing their sins. "Let us throw our crimes into the sea," says the doctor. He then places a piece of parchment in a bottle gourd. Everyone on the boat knows what it contains, this parchment, except us. It's Hugo's sense of suspense. The third episode, after the sin, the doom, is the punishment, the shipwreck. As with the drowning of Gilliatt on his rock, we follow in stages the progress of the waters as they rise around the bodies of the shipwrecked sailors. They all got on their knees. They all got on their knees. It was no longer in snow, but in water that they were kneeling. The doctor made the sign of the cross and spoke louder, while under his feet that rocking motion began, almost imperceptible, the signal that a wreck is about to go under. Amongst this gang of malefactors, where everyone came from somewhere different, each person recited Our Father in their own language. The doctor, captain of the ship, remained standing and was the last to speak. Sicut in coelo et in terra. So, end of Our Father. No one replied. He looked down. Every head was under water. Not one had stood up. They had let themselves drown on their knees. With his right hand, the doctor took up the gourd which he had placed upon the hatch and raised it above his head. The wreck was foundering. As he went under, the doctor murmured the rest of the prayer. His arm disappeared. The deep sea had no more ripples on it than a barrel of oil. The snow continued to fall. Something floated to the surface and bobbed away in the darkness. It was the gourd, sealed with pitch and kept afloat by its casing of willow. Juliette Drouet, who copied out the novel, at the same time Hugo was writing it, so she was the first reader, understood immediately the religious sense of the episode. I need to calm down and relax a bit. My nerves are on edge after that dreadful shipwreck, which is all the more tragic and more gloomily grandiose in its bleak impassivity than in the tumult and the hurly-burly of the tempest. God's justice does not need the wrath of nature to be fulfilled. Never mind if I'm talking nonsense. Far from talking nonsense, Juliette understood very well that the shipwreck is a divine punishment. The last episode of this religious story, the atonement, happens 400 pages later. Meanwhile, Gwynplaine becomes a showman, is arrested and believes himself to be lost in the prisons of the English monarchy, when the situation suddenly changes. The sheriff, instead of pursuing him, tells him he's lord and reads a parchment to him. It is the one the doctor wrote and which all the comprachicos have signed. It reveals their crime and Gwynplaine's aristocratic birth. Orphaned at 2 years of age, the son of a lord, he was sold to the comprachicos by King James II to despoil and destroy his family, the father being a rebel. Entrusted to the sea, will this exposure of their crime be enough to save their iniquitous souls? God alone knows. In this novel, of which it provides the title of one whole part, the ocean, entitled The Sea and the Night, the ocean serves as a poetical expression of apocalypse, calamity and revelation at the same time, and it serves an ethical expression of atonement. The message in a bottle, a common trope in adventure stories, is a symbol of providence. We find, too, in many adventure novels that the sea that engulfs can also be the sea that saves. In Alexandre Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantès, the hero, escapes from the Château d'If, a prison on a small rocky island in the Mediterranean of Marseille, by slipping himself inside the shroud of the Abbé Faria, who is being prepared for burial at sea. A cunning plan, but a risky one. Hugo makes the hero of Les Misérables take a similar risk. Jean Valjean, having become a jailbird once more in the prison at Toulon, comes to the aid of a sailor who is at risk of losing his life up high above the ship Orion. The sailor, hanging in the air, is likely to lose his grip at any time and to smash onto the deck or drown. Jean Valjean asks to have his ball and chain removed and then climbs up the rigging. He saves the sailor to the great joy of the watching crowd. But the crowd then witnesses Jean Valjean himself fall into the water. As the narrator adopts the crowd's point of view, the reader believes him to have drowned. 40 pages on, we find out that Jean Valjean was not dead. He dived into the sea on purpose and swam underwater until he reached a ship at anchor, where he hid before sneaking away. In this episode, where the sea is the accomplice of the hero and helps him against the injustice of man, the sea serves as a poetic expression of a dramatic human interest story, an ethical expression of cunning. In these two novels, the sea is the providential place where, confronted by his choices, man's true nature is revealed to itself, a place where he must take responsibility, where he must take note of his conscience, where he must take risks. The sea shows him what he really is, at the same time ties him to the universe. To conclude, I want to highlight that Hugo identified himself with the ocean. The ocean is for him a symbol of human destiny. There are indeed ocean men. These waves, this flux and reflux, this terrible back and forth, this noise of all the breaths together, these blacknesses and these transparencies, this vegetation from the chasm, this demagogy of clouds in the midst of the hurricane, these eagles in the spume, these enormous sobs, these glimpses of monsters, these nights of darkness cut through by roarings, these furies, these shipwrecks, these clashing waves, these human thunderings mingled with the thunder of the divine, this blood in the abyss, then these graces, these pleasant things, these celebrations, these gay white sails, these fishing boats, these songs amongst the tumult, these splendid ports, these smoke trails from the land, these towns on the horizon, this deep blue of water and the sky, this useful acridness, this bitterness that brings about the purification of the universe, this rough salt without which everything would rot, these angers and these appeasements, these hells and these paradises of the eternally emotional immensity, this infinite, this unfathomable, all this can be in a mind. And in that case, this mind is called genius. And you have Aeschylus, and you have Juvenal, you have Dante, you have Michelangelo, you have Shakespeare, you have Victor Hugo. And to look at these souls and to look at the ocean is the same thing. In this essay, where it is the metaphor of genius, the ocean serves as a poetic expression of the sublime and as an ethical expression of awe. To summarize, the ocean, in Hugo's poetry, theatre and novels, serves as a poetic, dramatic, and aesthetic setting for the solitary adventure, the epic in the ordinary, the macabre, the sense of vertigo, calamity, confrontation, the apocalypse, the sensational human interest story, the sublime. The moral values it brings with it are self-development, sacrifice, remembrance, humility, fidelity, loyalty, atonement, awe. The ocean is also, and above all, the form, at the same time tangible and impossible to grasp, of the infinite. Infinitely large, it can be represented by the other, the infinitely small, such as in the example of the inner eye of Philip II of Spain, which allows us to observe his immeasurably colonialist ideas. Such as, again, the little pool in the garden of the Escorial, the palace in Spain, where the misfortune of the rose symbolizes the smallness of the man who credits himself with too much power. Conversely, the ocean is at the same time both a metaphor for and the symbol of genius, immersed in the contemplation of the ocean, and of the all-powerful nature of love in times of adversity. Thank you.